Our first guest today is the U.S. Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Good to be with you.
Well, I know it's a busy week and there's been a lot of talk about climate issues, so let's just dive in. President Biden wants to spend $174 billion to boost electric vehicles. I'm wondering how much of that money would go to consumers to encourage them to trade in their gasoline car to get an electric vehicle, and how much would go to corporations to encourage the manufacturing of electric vehicles?
Well, certainly part of what we have to do is make electric vehicles more affordable for consumers. Electric vehicles can't be a luxury item if we really want to recognize that they're the future of car transportation and, critically, position the U.S. to be leading the world in manufacturing them with American workers with access to union jobs. So that does mean taking action to make sure that they are more affordable as that technology goes to the largest possible scale. But what we found is that while electric vehicles are getting closer and closer to being the same or even cheaper if you account for the fuel savings, that's still not enough for consumers or families who are worried about whether they can get to where they need to go, what's called range anxiety. Now, look, a lot of the cars going onto the market now can go 200, 300, 400 miles on a charge, but we like to take our road trips, and especially for rural areas or more spread out areas, there's still what's called range anxiety if you don't know if you can charge. That's why the funding that's contemplated here, yes, it includes ways to make sure that it's more affordable for consumers, but also deploying a national network of 500,000 charging stations so that we can really answer any of those concerns that might be the last thing holding somebody back from buying an electric vehicle.
Well, so let's start with the charging stations. You want to build, I believe, 500,000 around the country. But the question is, should the taxpayers fund that if not everyone's going to be driving an electric car immediately?
Well, so the idea here is to use federal investment to kickstart the development of these charging stations. We don't envision them as all being purchased, owned, and operated by the federal government. But we do know that we have to make some what I would call market-making investments to really help deploy these at scale and to get them out across different kinds of communities and areas, because there are some where we still don't have the density of electric vehicles in rural areas or along highways. But we're starting to be able to better and better map out where we most need these charging resources. In fact, this week, our Federal Highway Administration put out the latest round of information on the alternative fuel corridors that were designated as part of what it'll take to really get these from being not just a bunch of dots on a map, but a true national network. And we just don't think that'll happen without federal support.
Okay, and you also talked about the consumer incentives, trying to make these vehicles more affordable. There have been some federal tax credits, $7,500, but there's been a cap on those. And essentially they've helped to, subsidize the purchase of EVs by people who might have been early adopters anyways and might have purchased that. So the question is, would you extend those or increase the amount to make that EV purchase affordable to people like you and me?
Well, the tax credits, the original program, certainly had a big impact in driving the adoption of these technologies and helping that U.S.-based industry pick up. But as we look to the future, again, this can't be a luxury item. Indeed, it's often those who are under the most pressure in terms of their family transportation budget who have the most to gain by the fuel savings that are going to come about. So as we get into more detail in the policy design about how to deploy these funds, it's absolutely going to be done in a way that's really for everybody, not just for a few. After all, the vision is for this to very much be the future of how our cars work writ large.
How much support are you seeing in Congress so far for these kinds of incentives?
Well, there's certainly a lot of interest, but I also find that a lot of members, I still have to have conversations about just how far along the technology is. I got a question recently from someone who I don't think was familiar with the way that pickup trucks and those kinds of light-duty SUVs were evolving. Was still picturing, I think, maybe the small car for getting around a dense urban area. That's part of the EV story, but so are these pickup trucks coming online. And this isn't just about these new startups. It's also about Detroit stepping up and really making clear that they envision this as the future too. I'm talking to some rural members of Congress who are skeptical, which is why I need to make sure they understand that it's actually in their areas where people rely on vehicles the most, where they drive the longest distances and therefore spend the greatest amount of money on things like fuel. It's in areas like that we actually could have the most to gain. So we're definitely continuing to communicate the economic potential as well as the climate potential of this. But find that it's not that tough to convince Congress that we need to make big investments in infrastructure. We just got to make sure we convey why it's important that we have an expanded view of infrastructure that isn't just building it the way we would have built it in, say, 1950.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, I know the government, the federal government, has also talked about electrifying the fleet of government vehicles, which I think is something like 650,000 vehicles. But the first contract that was awarded for postal trucks had very little in the way of electric powertrains. I'm wondering if you're open to rethinking that contract to really accelerate EV development.
Well, the president is very clear that we should be using the purchasing power and frankly, just the example setting power of the federal government to help walk the talk and to help grow these kinds of markets. And so, there are obviously layers of complication around any individual procurement, but the president's executive order and some of the authorities that we think could come in future legislation will make it easier for us to lead by example and eventually capture for taxpayers those fuel savings. I know we're certainly looking into it, even just in terms of the fleet that we here at the Department of Transportation are responsible for. But there are much bigger fleets in terms of, as you mentioned, the Postal Service, DOD, and a lot of other places. And this really is a whole of government effort and approach.
Now, I know that electric vehicles are simpler and they don't require as many parts, and therefore there's not as many workers needed to assemble them. And so if I were an auto worker who'd spent her entire life building engines or transmissions, I might be worried about what's happening right now. Where are the jobs in this plan, and how will you retrain or help to retrain the workers?
Well, this plan will generate millions of jobs. And one of the most important things to understand about the job creation here is that we're talking primarily about blue-collar jobs, not jobs that demand a college degree in order to do them. Many of those are in the auto sector. And yes, one thing about electric cars is they don't break down as much and require as much maintenance. On the other hand, there are areas where we're just at the very beginning of building a domestic industry, like battery production, something that's very important for us to grow, frankly, for security as well as economic reasons right here on American soil. It's why you're going to see a lot about supply chains, a lot about Buy America provisions. The president has made it clear that all of us, all of our departments, need to look at how to make sure that more of what we fund, for example, in my department, we're thinking about things like when we're helping communities buy vehicles for transit, that all of that is driven through a focus on buying America and creating those American jobs. There's tons of job creation ahead. Yes, the technology is changing. Some of the specifics are going to be changing, and American workers have always shown a remarkable ability to adapt. But these are not all newfangled futuristic jobs that we're talking about. If you just think about everything from the building retrofits to the fiber we're going to have to lay down to the work that's going to have to go into creating the kind of rail infrastructure that we believe Americans deserve. We're talking about putting to work professions that we understand very well today. Union carpenters and electrical workers and insulators and glaziers and painters and pipe fitters. Kinds of people who are good at making things are going to do very well in a future where we're properly investing in infrastructure in this country.
Okay. Well, in the very few minutes we have left, I just wanted to touch briefly on autonomous vehicles, because I know there's a lot of interest among our viewers in that. Specifically, there have been some crashes recently with Tesla's autopilot system. and a fair bit of controversy about their rollout of so-called full self-driving software that's still in development. I'm wondering how the DOT will deal with those issues.
Well, the main reason that the DOT exists is safety, and that's our top priority. Now, the truth is technology has been developing maybe faster than policy in this regard. We've got a lot of very detailed authorities for regulating where mirror ought to go. They don't even contemplate a scenario where we're talking about sensors doing the work that mirrors or human beings used to. But these are technologies that are still being developed. I do want to emphasize that right now, no matter how sophisticated the technology in a car, we expect and require the presence of an attentive driver behind the wheel. Technologies exist to assist drivers, but in the vehicles available today, not to replace them.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're just about out of time, so I have so many more questions, but unfortunately, I think we're going to have to wrap up. I hope you'll come back and talk to us again because there's so many good issues to cover.
I'd love to.
Thank you.
Thank you
for joining us. Thank you.
Sure thing.